All right, so let's go to trade, because we actually may have some differences of opinion on trade. So President Trump has been quite anti-trade in his rhetoric. In policy, less so, because I think he's been moderated by a lot of members of his own administration. You know, a populist conservatism, the question is whether that's going to be a pro-trade conservatism. You talk about how you're pro-free trade. There are certain areas, however, where you're a lot more restrictionist on trade, particularly with regard to China. So where do you fall down on sort of the trade divide?
First of all, just my background. The government I led negotiated virtually all of Canada's contemporary trade agreements, except for NAFTA, except for then, obviously, the new USMCA. So I think, in fact, I probably have a record of signing more trade deals than just about any leader in the free world alive today. So I don't have much trouble saying that I'm pro-trade. But look, President Trump came along. I remember when we had this debate in the election, he came along and he started talking about good deals and bad deals. And people went, oh, you know, some quote economists started saying, oh, wow, he's a protectionist, bad deals. He could be a protectionist. But can you have a bad trade deal? Absolutely, you can have a bad trade deal. I mean, when companies, let's forget about governments. When companies do a commercial deal with another company, why do they have dozens of analysts and lawyers and accountants working over these deals? Because any deal would be a good deal? I mean, seriously. You have to really know what you're talking about when you negotiate something as complex as a trade deal. The United States, when the United States allowed China to enter the WTO, we set up a situation, Canada's in the same boat, where the Chinese have wide-ranging, unfettered access to almost all of our economy, and we can only sell to the Chinese when, where, and in what quantity and for how long they say we can. And obviously, in that kind of situation, what have we seen? We have seen massive imbalances. Imbalances, by the way, yeah, you know, economists will say a poor country like China is bound to have a trade surplus with the United States, but it's not bound to get bigger as China gets more wealthy, which is what is happening. This is because you have a bad deal that provides grossly unequal access, and the consequence has been the outflow of millions of jobs from the United States, from Canada to China, with no discernible benefits to our working population. So as a populist conservative, or frankly, I would say as a conservative, you don't sign deals like that. You sign deals where you know that overall your economy is going to benefit and that lots of people in your economy are going to benefit.
The countervailing case that's been made by particularly libertarians on trade has been, why would you tax your own citizens by essentially tariffing Chinese products in order to punish the Chinese? I mean, is the goal to have them lower their own tariffs, or is the goal to cut them out of the market because they're, quote unquote, sucking our jobs out? The fact is that we've gotten a lot of cheap products out of China, and people tend to see that as a bad thing, but the fact is that consumer prices have been going down in the United States consistently on a variety of levels.
But that's a terrible argument. You know, it's a terrible argument. First of all, the question of whether the tariff policy is effective is a different question. But the argument made by the apologists for the current Chinese trade relationship is, look, so we've lost all these jobs, so we've lost, you know, all these factories and everything have moved to China, but we get cheap products. But you know what? I get to sell stuff to you and you get to buy it. That's not a trade relationship. That's a purchase. And that's not the justification for trade. You know, even these libertarians will jump up and quote David Ricardo and classical economists. David Ricardo didn't say it would be a good idea for Britain to open its markets if it couldn't sell its goods anywhere else. He made the argument for reciprocal trade. And that is the core of the argument for reciprocal trade. And the idea that a trade relationship, no matter how badly structured, is somehow good for you. Losing jobs, losing well-paying jobs by the millions to get cheap products, which, by the way, in most cases you could get from places other than China, is not an argument for the kind of trade imbalance we have seen and the kind of economic outflows we've seen. That's, by the way, you know, obviously there's a separate question about China being a geopolitical and strategic rival. But even leaving that aside, that's not a good economic relationship. And the president, in my view, the president not only is right, the president deserves a lot of credit as the first president willing to take on this. The current trade relationship with China is beneficial to a few well-connected American corporations who get to operate in China. But it's not beneficial to the economy as a whole, and something has to be done about that. Or we are going to see a situation where China's economy is the largest in the world with a grossly unequal trade access to the United States, and that's not in anybody's interest.
Well, I mean, the fact is, again, if they have a grossly unequal trade access to the United States, we still are getting cheap products much cheaper than they were 30 years ago.
With a 3 to 400, well, now close to $400 billion outflow.
Right. Well, again, their capital account surpluses. I mean, that money has to go somewhere. And presumably it's going into buying all of the debt that we're selling them.
So, I just think it's a nonsensical argument. It's contrary to common sense. It's contrary to common sense.
I mean, are trade deficits always bad?
No, trade deficits are not always bad. And trade deficits under many circumstances would be expected. We know I know as an economist, it's likely the poorer country will have a trade surplus with a richer country simply because the richer country can buy more goods. It's also, I would argue the case of Canada. Canada in the last few years has tended to have a small trade surplus with the United States. Why? Because of the energy trade, a vital commodity that the United States has had a special need for. But is a trade deficit in and of itself nothing to worry about? Look, anybody who thinks that trade surpluses don't matter has forgotten to tell the Chinese, because they are building their economy into a powerhouse through a deliberate strategy of running trade surpluses with Western countries.
So I guess this is the real question. Do you think they're building their economy into a powerhouse, or are they building themselves into a military geopolitical powerhouse with that extra cash?
Both.
Meaning it seems to me that their economic plans are unsustainable. Subsidizing certain industries and cutting out other industries as a result is not a sustainable path for any country that wishes to be growing into the future and actually developing into the future. But it is a good path for centralizing capital right now and then using that capital in order to expand your military dominance in the region.
So look, I would say there's aspects of Chinese economic policy are not sustainable over the long term.
And they're building empty cities.
But, well, not entirely. I've been to a lot of those cities. They're pretty full. The fact of the matter is these, they've created tens of millions of jobs. And some of those tens of millions of jobs have been created not through direct subsidy, and some of it's direct subsidy, some of it's international, some of it's intellectual property theft, but some of it is just by having access to a market and restricting access to their own market, keeping cash in China and bringing more cash into China. So the idea that we should never worry about a surplus, no matter what the circumstances, I just think defies economic logic.
If tariffs are that good, why aren't we using them? Meaning that if China
every country uses tariffs all the time.
I mean, to the extent that the Chinese are. So meaning that China is obviously tariffing American products, you say, to centralize.
Yeah, but it's more
power.
than, I think the real problem in China is greater than the tariff. The real problem in China is that the Chinese government basically sanctions entry into your market, with or without a tariff. Unless the government says you can sell in the market and you can continue to sell, you cannot sell, period. Which, by the way, I think is where the Trump administration is likely to head over time. If they can't get the Chinese market more open, I think they're basically going to establish a managed trade relationship with China where they say, okay, if we can't enter into your market, some of your products are just not going to enter into our market. And you're starting to see that in some of the technology space.
So do you think that the end goal should be to get the Chinese to get rid of these tariffs on our products?
No, the end goal should be for China to have its market more open, not just tariffs down, but have a more open marketplace. There's no reason, for instance, that American and Canadian consumer product agencies shouldn't be able to sell freely on Alibaba, which they can't today.
Right.
No reason that should be prevented. And by the way, and we're arguing about this being economic logic, it's not that the Chinese don't want these products.
Right.
They'll pay a premium for these products. They want our products. So we should have an opportunity there. So yeah, obviously I would never support, don't get me wrong, I would never support the idea of the administration pursuing any kind of trade war with protectionism as the goal. But the goal to be reciprocal market opening is completely reasonable. I think the challenge, Ben, is that the whole nature of the Chinese economic structure and the nature of the government's role in the economy raises questions as to whether they can really truly open their markets in the way we're expecting, or whether they'll always reserve the right to just shut them at the drop of a hat.
And this does raise the question of security risk. So it seems to me that if you're going to direct trade policy for the United States or for any other Western country with regard to China, that, as you say, there should be a couple of goals. And this has sort of been Larry Kudlow's point inside the trade relationship. He's basically running trade for Trump. Trump keeps saying he likes protectionism, and then Kudlow says, no, what he really means is that he wants to use our trade policy in order to lower tariffs and trade barriers in other places, which seems correct. And
that seems, I think in fairness, I mean, I've been like you, I've been critical of many things about Donald Trump, especially during his run for the presidency. I think if you look on balance, his record to date would indicate that he is a guy using protectionist measures to open markets rather than to pursue protectionism. But I think the jury's still out on some aspects.
No, I think that's right. I think that whether he intends to or not, that's what he is doing, meaning that I think that, in his head, from everything that he says, he sounds like a guy who doesn't actually get basic Ricardian economics, but but his trade people do, and so they're able to.
He is also a businessman.
That's true
nature.
too.
So he gets the practical issues of whether it matters that you can actually sell products, as opposed to the theoretical arguments about trade.
So it seems to me that possibility one, you use those measures in order to lower the trade barriers in places like China.
Right.
And possibility number two is that he actually, as many of his advisors do, sees China as a geopolitical threat, and he feels like helping them grow their economy is actually a geopolitical problem, that the goal shouldn't be necessarily opening up the Chinese market to American goods and creating a better reciprocal trade relationship. Maybe the goal should actually be to curb Chinese power in the region. And so when he says national security is a rationale for trade policy, he actually means it.
He actually means it. Well, look, here is, I discuss this issue in my book. I think the history with the United States, it really stems from post-World War II and the Marshall Plan. American policy essentially has become, we promote, since the Marshall Plan, we promote open trade and open markets because, first of all, even if we give unequal access, we're the United States and the relationship, we're the bigger guy, it benefits us anyway. And secondly, the effect of open trade and open markets is to produce open and democratic societies that end up being American friends or allies. Now, I think that theory is really being tested with China, because here you have a country that could conceptually be, in fact, probably will be, a bigger economy than the United States. But furthermore, the entire practice of its economic policy is explicitly for the purpose of not opening up the governing structures of the country. It is, in fact, to preserve the constitutional, the authoritative monopoly of the Communist Party and its method of governance. And I would argue to be a strategic rival of the United States. Certainly, if you believe Xi Jinping, that's exactly what they intend. So I think these things get mixed up. Now, would I say that I would still be in the Henry Kissinger school that if you can engage in a genuine relationship that opens up China, in time, that is bound to make China, even a much bigger China, a society more like Western democracies and more friendly and less confrontational with Western democracies. But that's a theory, and that theory isn't panning out real well at the moment.